Good morning. My name is Thomas Dale, and I'm Professor of Art History at UW-Madison. I'm honored to welcome you to this session, Medieval Studies Perspectives on Contemporary Race and Cultural Encounter. Our program draws on the experience of a seminar that I taught last spring, Visualizing Race from Antiquity to Early Modernity. Our purpose is to explore pre-modern concepts of race and cultural encounter in conversation with the present. In part one of our program, 4 graduate students will briefly discuss what they learned in the seminar and how it has impacted their own research. In part 2, we will introduce 2 articles we read for seminar and give audience members an opportunity to comment and ask questions of their own via chat. In the final part, we will ask the audience to reflect on how medieval perspectives might inform your own understanding of race and diversity today. Before I turn to our 4 panelists, I want to emphasize why it is so important for us to have this conversation now. One reason is that, well, white supremacists have increasingly weaponized visual symbols of the medieval past to promote white power and racism. Runic inscriptions, Norse symbols, so-called Celtic crosses, Scandinavian helmets are all appropriated by white supremacist groups, both online and in demonstrations, such as the one that happened at Charlottesville in 2017. And these medieval symbols are ascribed to a pre-racial medieval all-white past. In Madison itself, during protest marches following the murder of George Floyd, one counter-demonstrator appeared in the costume of a white knight, and another wore a t-shirt depicting a crusader with a text describing how a warrior of Christ overcomes the dark forces of evil. I see a disturbing echo of Nazi propaganda depicting Adolf Hitler in the guise of a white knight on horseback, something evidently he never did dress up as a knight. But there is also a less explicit racial bias in scholarship and popular culture views of the Middle Ages that romanticizes the whiteness of courtly love and knighthood. In pushing back against these characterizations of the medieval past, scholars have pointed to overlooked aspects of diversity in medieval societies. For example, the early Christian saint Maurice from Thebes in Egypt was first depicted as a black African in the 13th century in a sculpture at Magdeburg Cathedral. And this has been cited as evidence for racial diversity within a multi-ethnic Holy Roman Empire under Frederick II, whose court included prominent Jews and black Muslims in positions of authority. At the same time, however, greater attention has been focused on the roots of blatantly racist discourses within medieval art that cast the non-Christian other as monstrous races. Thus, an English bestiary, that's a book of the beasts from the 13th century, reflects rampant anti-Jewish sentiment in England at the time by depicting a 3-headed monster and a single-footed sciopod, one of the monstrous wonders of the East described by Pliny, as Jews with hooked noses and pointed caps. And at right, we see black African slaves who were already present in Italy by the 13th century, dehumanized here as the prey for lions at the entrance to a church. Behind these images lie what Cornel West has described as genealogies of racism, rooted in the ancient world, including texts by Aristotle and Hippocrates that tied character and temperament to climate and geography. Thus, the darker-skinned peoples and exotic races described as inferior in character to white-skinned Northern Europeans were relegated to intemperate zones on world maps, far from the sacred center of Christendom in Jerusalem. Until recently, medievalists have argued against using the term race for medieval Europe, because its origins as a term are to be traced only to the 15th century, and it has been tied to conventional biological definitions of race, focused on bloodlines rather than culture. By contrast, Geraldine Heng suggests that race is a powerful term that must be harnessed to reveal continuities between modern and pre-modern racial thinking. She offers a capacious definition of race as a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences that serves to distribute positions and powers differentially to human groups. Paralleling the sentiments of Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, among others, medievalists of color have recently argued forcefully that we need to take a more activist stance, an activist anti-racist stance, in both our scholarship and our teaching. For to be silent about systemic racism in the Middle Ages or the ethnic complexities of medieval European societies is a form of white innocence, an exclusion that perpetuates racist myths of medieval whiteness. It is with these thoughts in mind that we invite you to explore the topic of race and the intersections between medieval and modern worlds. And I just wanted to remind you, before I turn to the students, that the University of Wisconsin is in the midst of medieval indigenous settlement. We have a series of effigy mounds and burial mounds, many of which date from between the 11th and 13th centuries, the very time of the building of the Gothic cathedrals in medieval Europe. So it's an important encounter to think about in our midst on this campus. I'd now like to turn to welcome the first of our 4 graduate student panelists, Andy Barrow.
Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank both Professor Dale and my colleagues from the Art History and Scandinavian Studies departments for allowing me to be here today. I'd like to briefly speak about how some of my work in Professor Dale's seminar as an example of how late medieval and Renaissance art might help us think about diversity and representation in the artwork on UW's own campus. For my final project in our class, I studied depictions of the 12th century Andalusian Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, now better known by his Latin name, Averroes. In the traditional canon of Western philosophy, Averroes is mostly acknowledged for writing commentaries on Aristotle, which influenced the all-important late medieval scholar and patron saint of the Jesuit order, Thomas Aquinas. This relationship is reflected in the altarpiece you can see here, which was commissioned by the Jesuit order in Pisa over 200 years after Thomas's death. Unlike many of the works we studied over the course of the semester, this image is not overtly a racist caricature. Averroes is depicted wearing the robes of a scholar, and his book is open to reveal pseudo-Arabic text, possibly demonstrating the importance of his original thought to Thomas. When viewed in this decontextualized fashion, it's even possible to read this panel as a kind of positive representation of Averroes as a contributor to a diverse international tradition of medieval philosophy, which is not exclusively European, Christian, or Western. However, when we zoom out to view the work as a whole, a new and very different symbolic language becomes apparent. Rather than appearing as a philosopher and thinker in his own right, Averroes is instead displayed as a tiny and insubstantial figure sprawled out at Thomas's feet. The nuanced scholarly debate between Thomas and Averroes is rewritten in this panel, such that it does not appear as an exchange of ideas, but rather as a triumph in which Thomas's tradition overcomes both Averroes and Islamic philosophy as a whole. What this panel depicts, in other words, isn't the history of Thomas and Averroes at all, but rather the story that suited the institution that commissioned the work of art, that institution being the Jesuit order in Pisa. In this version of history, the Jesuits' patron saint does not take part in a conversation with Islamic philosophy at all, but rather overcomes and subsumes it as part of a distinctly Western and Christian tradition. Viewed in its totality, the panel is still a celebration of the diversity of medieval philosophy, of the medieval philosophical tradition, but it's one in which that diversity is being used strategically to fulfill a particular institution's need to shape the narrative of its own history. For me, the takeaway from this project in the class as a whole is that as people who are every day surrounded by symbols and retellings of our shared past, we have a responsibility to become aware of how institutions take advantage of concepts like diversity and change them to suit their own ends. I'll end my remarks with a concrete modern example. Most of you are probably familiar with the statue of Abraham Lincoln, which sits at the top of Baskin Hill on the UW campus. By itself, the statue is ambiguous. Does it celebrate Lincoln and his role as the quote-unquote great emancipator, or does it commemorate the less well-known side of Lincoln's government, which, in addition to other atrocities, used the Dakota War as a pretext to expel uninvolved Ho-Chunk people living in Minnesota? Historian Patty Lowe reports that more than 550 Ho-Chunk people were killed by this process of forced removal, all in order that their land might be appropriated by white settler colonists. So, decontextualized, it might seem like Abe represents a liberal and egalitarian vision of higher education, but what happens when we zoom out and note that Baskin Hill was until 1857 the site of one of those burial mounds that Professor Dale alluded to, which was then dug up and destroyed in order to build the modern UW campus? What does it mean for representatives of this university to use conference rooms built on stolen land to hold seminars celebrating the diversity of an overwhelmingly white institution, which not only benefits from the legacy of land appropriation, but continually heroizes it in statues like this? Our purpose in coming here today is to build a community, but the symbolism of the Abe statue makes it clear that in doing so, we're furthering the institutional legacy of an attempted genocide. These are some of the questions I considered while taking this class, and I hope that we can spend some time thinking about them today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Özlem Eren. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Art History. I'm studying the art and architecture of medieval Russia. One of the biggest tasks in this study is to disentangle the origins of the medieval Rus from modern nationalistic and patriotic narratives and put it in the context of a more complex world history. In the 18th century, one theory of the origin of Rus was put forward that says the state of Kievan Rus was founded by the Norsemen or Vikings. Others claimed that Russians were Slavs who have lived in the south of Kiev since the prehistoric times. A critical examination reveals weaknesses on both sides. The idea of the original inhabitants of medieval Russia as either white Nordic Europeans or Eastern European Slavs is now difficult to support on historical or cultural grounds. Professor Dale's seminar on visualizing race helped me put these modern historical myths within the context of race. While I have lived for many years in the US, I have been exposed to the topics of race only recently. Our seminar on race finally brought the subjects of race and religion out of my mental list of topics that I avoid talking about. Through the analysis of medieval images, I connected the gaps between the past and the present. I have gained analytical tools to resist any biased narrative in my own scholarship on medieval Rus, and started to view it under the wider conjuncture of migrations, intermixing, and formation of new identities over several centuries. The theory of Viking or Slavic origins excludes the evidence of a more complicated history. For several centuries in the steppes of Central Asia or along the Volga River, trade routes frequently passed, battles happened, and populations mixed. It's not surprising to find motifs inspired from the Persian art or the arts of the nomadic cultures in the examples of medieval Russian art. Russian princes appropriated symbols of power from the Byzantine Empire, but also from the Balkans, as well as the Persian Empire and the Islamic world. Some Persian textile fragments from the 10th to 12th centuries display the griffin, lion, and dog images that are also found in some Russian church decorations. These were part of a common vocabulary. The lunar shape of the bronze pendants from Central Asia is somewhat similar to the Byzantine, Rus, and Bulgarian pendants from the 11th century. I'm interested in what these objects meant for the Rus. What kind of ties did they represent with the multicultural populations in the steppe and the Central Asian nomads? I have found the terminology of race and ethnicity challenging in this seminar because these terms have different connotations in my native Turkey. This has been the missing piece in my understanding of why I have struggled with certain definitions and concepts in this course. The secular ideals of the Turkish Republic effectively eliminated talking and thinking about race. Growing up under a secular system in Turkey, which strictly prohibited the displays of religious signs, headscarves, and crosses, we have always been warned by our parents to never talk about religion. This creates a very unclear picture in our minds about the realities of assimilation, racism, and othering in the society. I had a much rosier image of the world that we have been living in. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Holly MacArthur, and I'm a PhD student from the Department of German Nordic Slavic Plus. I've thought a lot about what to say with the 5 minutes I have for today. I specialize in philology, literary criticism, and the literary culture of the medieval Nordic world, a topic that is far more multicultural and far less Viking focused than most would expect. I do, of course, have to know about the so-called Vikings, simply because it is currently a topic of great interest thanks to certain television series, and perhaps more significantly because it has for a long time drawn the attention of white supremacists in search of their idealized all-white European past. The conversation about reception and appropriation of medieval symbols and images drew me to Professor Dale's seminar precisely because it's a conversation that I will inevitably have more times than I care to begin to imagine. Dismantling the myth of an all-white society is one part of the puzzle. Actually being able to discuss medieval perspectives on race, which so many are quick to exclude from consideration, is equally important. The Nordic countries traveled widely, and only sometimes were they on Viking, essentially off conducting pirate raids. They were renowned traders and travelers. Figures in the Icelandic sagas were admired for traveling to Constantinople, for joining the Varangian Guard, and for bringing back plenty of wealth. We have records of visits to Alexandria in Egypt, as well as Morocco. What this class specifically allowed me to do was to consider the effect of wider European continental racialized concepts on the Nordic perspectives. My main work is with the translation of continental European romances into Old Norse, a practice which seems at least partially based around Scandinavia's desire to integrate culturally with the rest of Europe. The course helped me explore the question of how that cultural influence influenced the ways Jews in particular were portrayed in art and literature, although there's plenty of room to explore how Scandinavians viewed other groups as well. I focused on the image of the Jew and the facial caricatures which traveled from continental developments into some of the more isolated parts of Scandinavia. Ol is located several hundred kilometers inland from the major trade center at Bergen on the west coast, and much of that distance is staggeringly vertical in the form of fjords and mountains. It was also home to a church, constructed about 1250, which featured an extraordinary painted ceiling. What drew my interest was this portrayal of the crucifixion and the two Jewish faces. Both are shown with startlingly pale white skin, prominent hooked noses, and of course, a pointed Jew hat to make sure that the viewer knows exactly who is participating in the death of Christ. While I cannot discount the possibility that the people involved in the church's construction traveled, it is much less likely that any of the people living near and using the church at all would have encountered an actual Jewish person. No Jews are documented to have lived in medieval Norway or anywhere in Scandinavia, but racialization and fear of Jewish conspiracy still existed. The church reflects the same racialized imagery of the Jewish face that we find in many continental manuscripts, and here I would refer to Sarah Lipton's book, Dark Mirror, which specifically addresses that development. The wooden ceiling at Old represents one of the problems I kept coming back to over the course of this seminar and our many productive discussions. If the only image of a group you ever saw portrayed them strictly as an enemy of your religion and evil-looking to boot, how would you react towards them if you then met them in reality? The execution of 9 men on the island of Gotland in 1350 for a supposed conspiracy with the Jews to poison the wells and bring the Black Death to the island proves that even the absence of an actual Jewish presence cannot fully prevent anti-Semitic violence in medieval Scandinavia. The consistent portrayal of Jews as other thus contributes to violence even in absentia. If the face is always monstrous, how else should one be expected to act? This was the question that this seminar helped me begin to ask. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Drew Narayanan, and I'm a PhD student in the Art History Department. My research for the seminar focused on the depiction of Saracens in French medieval manuscripts. While I use Saracen to reference Latin Christian polemical imaginations of Islamic polities, it must be noted that this term is still used by white nationalists today to justify violence against Muslim communities. Professor Dale has briefly acknowledged the ways Latin Christians use dark skin tones to monstrify the Islamic other. Conversely, whiteness could also be used to racialize, as demonstrated in this 14th century French illumination of Al-Mansur's historical sacking of Santiago de Compostela. In stark contrast to the blue-skinned figure from the Luttrell Psalter, the Muslims here appear light-skinned despite defecating in the church, a deeply sacrilegious act with even more egregious implications. In fact, they appear to be indistinguishable from the Christians that they slaughter. Given the clearly polemicized Saracen act of defecation, how can we explain this departure from more obviously racialized depictions? One potential reason could be that the illuminator sought to convey the phenotypical diversity of the Muslim world. Previous scholarship has described how some Iberian caliphs were recorded as fair-skinned and light-haired, in part the result of Muslim-Christian marriage alliances. But if the intention of white skin was only to represent Islamic ethnic diversity, why not provide these figures with the turbans and scimitars that are so frequently applied to their darker-skinned comrades? An explanation for this epidermal visualization can be found in religious law. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 called for both Muslims and Jews to wear certain types of clothing to indicate their non-Christian status within Europe, for fear of religious mixing. Thus, European Christian anxieties of masquerading Muslims, impostors in the mist who did not comply, is reflected in a fantasized narrative of Islamic conquest. Simultaneously, the image insists on a more overt alterity by depicting what Saracens allegedly do when they enter churches. Europeans viewed Islam as literally a dirty religion, and frequently associated Muslims with feces. A clear example is found on the Hereford map, where a statue of Mahoun, a modification of Muhammad, squats on an altar and defecates. As Asa Mittman explains, the act of defecation serves as evidence of Mahoun's life, much as Christ's stigmata wounds reflects his own. Thus, the image perpetuates the concept that Muhammad is a disturbing inversion of Christ, an impostor in himself. The scene intentionally perverts Christian sacred space. In Christianity, the altar is normally the place where the sacrament of the Eucharist is consecrated. However, here, in Christian imagined Islam, the altar becomes a site of corruption, a space where a sort of unholy consecration can occur. The defecation at Compostela functions as a loaded metaphor for Saracens transforming the pilgrimage site into a mosque. As Mahoun defecates on his altar, so too do the Saracens shit, signifying the shift from a Christian space to an Islamic one. While Christians reenact the Last Supper at the altar through consumption, Saracens purportedly reenact the filth associated with Muhammad through defecation. This narrative is only furthered by the Muslims' initial stripping of the church, removing the elements inside needed to make it one, as a way to prepare the space in becoming a mosque. The text itself establishes al-Mansur's intentions of Islamifying Iberia, noting he, quote, boasted that he would conquer Spain and restore it to pagan law. Indeed, the reestablishment of Islam certainly implies the appropriation of Christian spaces. In the end, the Muslims ultimately fail. God strikes out against Saracen conquest, plaguing them with blindness and diarrhea until they leave Spain. Nonetheless, the visual iconography endures, continuously reimagining horrifying practices. Just as Muhammad impostors Christ via filth, so too do the Muslims mimic Christians in appearance, tying together two different types of racialized Saracen behavior. Of course, such narratives also possess a long and contemporary afterlife, as demonstrated not only by the alt-right's appropriation of the term Saracen for their own propaganda, but in the all too familiar and frequent articulations of dirty Arabs and deceptive Muslims, so pervasive in post-9/11 America. Thank you.
Thank you, all these wonderful panelists, for presenting your work. And I wanted to now pause to see if there are any questions or comments. So there aren't any questions at the moment, but there will be opportunities for the audience to put in some questions or comments on what's been said. This next part that we're moving into now will be sharing with you brief summaries of readings that were made available in advance. 2 readings, one by Pamela Patton, entitled Blackness, Whiteness, and the Idea of Race in Medieval European Art. And the second one, an article by Maggie Williams entitled Celtic Crosses and the Myth of Whiteness. The first reading will be introduced by Özlem Eren and Drew Narayanan.
Thank you, Professor Dale. Patton discusses the complexity of thinking about racialized blackness in the Middle Ages. Take, for example, the so-called Black Madonna. Was it originally painted as black, or did it change colors due to weathering over time? Patton asks, was blackness racial in the Middle Ages? And what meanings did it hold for the medieval viewers?
She outlines several ambiguous categories in understanding dark skin in medieval art. Firstly, skin color signaled abstract social and moral qualities. Early Christian theologians wrote about the newly baptized as literally whitened. Black saints and biblical figures paradoxically confirmed the skin-sin connection. These characters, such as the biblical Queen Sheba and Saint Maurice, only serve as figures who have overcome their implied moral inferiority. Indeed, some narratives imagine dark-skinned characters become white in the aftermath of baptism. Secondly, skin color also signaled geographical origin and concepts associated with it. Darkness implied being from a territory outside of medieval Europe, thus enmity, danger, and monstrosity. Finally, skin color referred to social status. Dark skin suggested low social status or slavery. This has roots in ancient Roman art, where figures such as a bath attendant or a camel driver were stereotyped with African features. In the Middle Ages in Europe, we don't see darkness associated with slavery as much. Instead, we see depicted darkness in connection with religious identity. Skin color representing only the presumed geographical origins is rare in medieval art. One context in which medieval artists have linked skin color with presumed physical appearance is the Catalan Atlas. the image of the king of Mali, Mansa Musa. In this example, Latin Christians created depictions based upon expected physiognomic and epidermal appearance as a result of geography without a negative implication. These examples show how few of the meanings of skin color were related to race.
Medieval Europeans had neither a consistent definition of race nor had a clear connection between skin color and race, as is often attested today. The connotations of skin color evolved over time, often combined with social, moral, and religious values. In the early modern period, geographical expansion, colonization, and scientific discoveries contributed to the classification of people into races. Medieval blackness not only served as a marker of one single category, but it could also be conflated together as seen in the Luttrell Psalter. The image supposedly depicting Richard the Lionheart in battle with Saladin embodies imaginations of foreignness as well as religious conflict. The visual subtext here also implies Christian supremacy over Islam, as well as the desire to crusade far away over there for economic benefits. Yet even Patton's interpretation of the image of Mansa Musa as an exception remains problematic. What does it mean to imagine a black Islamic king dressed in European royal attire such as orb, scepter, and trefoil Catholic crown? What promises of wealth does he hold for the Latin Christian imagination? Thank you.
At this point, I'd just like to actually go back to the chat. There was a little time delay, and we do have some responses to our earlier presentations, but I want to leave these reflection questions on the screen that have been formulated regarding the article by Patton, and you can react to the mini presentation you've just heard, or if you've had the chance to read the reading, you might have your own viewpoint on this particular understanding of blackness and whiteness and the idea of race. But first, let me go back to address some of the questions that arose from the first presentations. So here is a question. This might be too much of a niche question, but I'd be curious to know what Professor Dale and the graduate students think about the content and role of a medieval art survey or an introduction to medieval art course, especially at a large public university where it's now urgent and important to directly address the scholarly shift towards the global Middle Ages. The arguments around what global means in the period of circa 500 to 1500, if there's some value in maintaining a survey that focuses on medieval Europe, if an introductory course should now really address contemporary issues. And that's a really wonderful, wonderful question, and I think it's precisely what motivated me as a teacher to address race more directly in all of my teaching. However, my response would be not to abandon the medieval survey. In fact, I think that medieval surveys are all the more important now, but we have to think about how the medieval period has been configured in the past. It has been much more focused on Western Europe and on national histories. And I think now we're much more attuned to the global nature of the Middle Ages, and that is in part the global Mediterranean world, which includes North Africa and the Middle East, but there is also the exchanges that are well documented between the Norse, Iceland, and North America. We have an indigenous Middle Ages that we referred to in some points of contact. So I would say we want to have a more global approach to medieval surveys, and I think we can do that. But also I think we need to address race more explicitly. I have to admit that in the past, when dealing with medieval Christian European art, I've referred to Old Testament, New Testament subjects, and of course that reflects a Christian bias. Old Testament subjects in the Christian Bible originate as subjects in the Hebrew Bible, and of course Jews don't consider that to be the Old Testament. That's their scriptural tradition. So even just the way in which we use terms and the assumptions of what is normative. The Middle Ages is much broader than we've allowed it to be. So great question. Also, we have another question from Asa Mittman. Wonderful to hear him. He's one of the great leaders in scholarship on medieval race and monstrosity today. Glad to have him listening in. I think I've read about some, but I can't recall the details. I wonder if this specific motif is still in use in anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so I guess that would be addressed to you, Drew, the motif of the defecating image, the Muslim idol on the Christian altar.
You know, when I was trying to find images, thank you for your question, Professor Mittman. When I was trying to find images for the last slide to you know, demonstrate Islamophobia in the United States, I did see several sort of images that I thought were too racist to show. Memes that talked about Muslims, you know, calling other people dirty and then supposedly not using toilet paper or wiping their rears with their naked hand. So the conflation of shit, of defecation and Islam, I think is alive and well in anti-Muslim rhetoric, as well as deception as well. The notion, alt-right thinkers have, you know, looked into or used the Islamic notion, the sometimes Islamic notion of taqiyya, which is more frequent in Shia Islam than it is in Sunni, but which allows for a kind of plausible deniability. And so they've read this as a kind of, oh, there are secret Muslims hiding among us, denying their true nature.
Well, I think we're going to move on then to the discussion section of the two articles. And I just wanted to mention those of you who have signed up for this particular workshop session, this breakout session, when you registered, if you registered for this specific session, you should have had the readings made available to you through the Diversity Forum. If that's not the case, if you weren't able to get to the readings, if you would like to email me at teedale@wisc.edu, I would be very pleased to share those readings with you. And they come from a very valuable collection entitled Whose Middle Ages? And Holly's going to just show you that book cover. Both readings are part of this collection, and it speaks to the earlier question about how we teach the Middle Ages and the necessity of engaging issues of race and diversity today. So there are some great resources out there. There are some other questions emerging, and I think we will come to those questions and comments as we go through the readings. I see that I'm just moving down the stream here to see how these questions fit with what we're discussing now. Well, I'm going to just address very briefly another question here because it relates to what we were talking about in the first section. Serena Larkin is asking, are there ways in which medieval scholars are interrupting or contradicting erroneous uses of that era's symbols through public engagement, op-eds, public presentations? Yes, exactly, precisely. And in fact, this is partly why we're doing this session, to just point out some ways in which the medieval past has been misrepresented as an all-white, non-diverse, even non-racial past, when we know really that's impossible, the way human relationships have been structured. It's power relationships in the past and the present. Not to say that the medieval past is the same as the present, but there are some common systemic racisms in terms of the structuring of relations of different peoples that are shared in common. So in terms of combating the misuse of medieval symbols, yes, I would just point out there's a wonderful site called The Public Medievalist that regularly has articles addressing these topics, addressing issues of gender, race, cultural identity, popular cultural representations of the Middle Ages. So there's quite a lively forum there. That's just one of many. I'd also mention the group called Medievalists of Color, who are specifically medievalists who are working in the field, writing about issues of race. And as medievalists of color, people of color in the field, they recognize the certain systemic aspects of racism even within the discipline of medieval studies, and are working for a more inclusive medieval studies community. So I'd also recommend looking at that site. They post a number of important articles there as well. I now then want to move on to this next section then. First of all, in terms of these questions that we're asking here, how is religious difference imagined visually, and what is the impact of repeated encounter with such images of the non-Christian other? Issues addressed particularly in terms of skin color. How do medieval images also complicate modern American equivalents of race and skin color? I'm just seeing if anyone is responding to those questions. I see someone is commenting on the issue of Viking and Celtic iconography in relation to Maggie Williams' article. I think what I'm going to do, as I'm not seeing any specific questions about this first segment, I'm going to ask Andy and Holly to present Maggie Williams' article, and then we can come back to any questions that people are thinking about that second part. Oh, well, wait a moment. Here is a question that's here's a question that's just come in from Sabina Gross, who directs the honors program and is a faculty member in the German department. Here's what Sabina says. This does relate to this discussion of Patton. She says, wondering about representations of demons and Satan. Many that I know show them as white. Is there a correlation going back to the Middle Ages of skin color, and in particular blackness, as demonic, reaching back to medieval times? And that's a very good question. I think it was something that emerged from the individual presentations that, well, on one hand, there is this long-standing practice associating, going back even to biblical texts, of associating darkness with evil, and whiteness, light with divinity. When we get into the High Middle Ages in terms of visual representations, it's not entirely consistent. So it's very good that you brought up this notion. I mean, it was interesting. Holly's presentation showed that the Jews were represented as actually being white. They were caricatured. They had hooked noses, but it was sort of a ghostly white in contrast to the flesh colors, the sort of rosy-cheeked, sort of Northern European skin colors of the figures in the narrative of the Passion of Christ. So there is a positionality here too, in terms of where you are within Europe and what skin color will be considered normative. In the ancient Greek world, of course, a sort of a brown skin would be normative for the Mediterranean world, and that is commented on sometimes. But when we get into the 13th century, it's been suggested, Madeline Cavanis has argued this, that there's a kind of an invention of whiteness and visual representation at the very time in which there are more encounters with Black Africans, partly because of the Crusades, Black Saracens from North Africa, partly within Europe itself. Consider Spain under Muslim rule between the 8th century and parts of it up all the way into the 15th century. So there is an association of Blackness with the vectors of religion, as suggested in Patton's article, as well as the connection with social status. We have in English Psalters the representation of both Muslims and serfs, people working the land with dark skins, and caricatured in a way that suggests a kind of social inferiority. So it's complicated. The black and white divide many times is used to suggest a contrast between the divine and the diabolical, between the Christian and the non-Christian, and with the blackness associated with the negative side. But then we have the whole question of models of blackness that are more positive from the Song of Songs. We have the bride of the Song of Songs, and blackness is celebrated there. So it's a complicated issue, which is why we have to be so careful and contextualize each instance that we're talking about. So I'm now going to move on then to the second reading introduction, the article by Maggie Williams. And Drew and Andy and Holly are going to introduce this second reading.
Thank you, Professor Dale. In the second article for our session today, Maggie Williams outlines a white nationalist perspective of the so-called Celtic cross in a quote taken from the infamous neo-Nazi forum Stormfront. The quote illustrates exactly why modern-day white supremacists use this key symbol of a crossed circle as a replacement for the Nazi swastika. They view it as a representation of both Christianity and a monolithic white pre-Christian European identity. Despite the associations of the Celtic cross with Christianity and whiteness, Williams points out that the crossed circle predates the medieval reintroduction of Christianity to the British Isles entirely. The encircled cross motif found in the converted Christian Isles is actually a longer Latin cross with a taller vertical bar and a shorter horizontal crossbar, not the equal-armed cross found at white supremacist rallies like this one here from France. Despite the name, the Latin cross itself has Egyptian or Syrian origins based on materials that we've found. The closer visual parallel to the Celtic cross is found in a motif from the Bronze Age, a carving. It was not limited to the British Isles and was found throughout Scandinavia and the Nordic world among various carved reliefs. Williams points out that it was used to represent chariot wheels or as part of a wider decoration, but its exact function as a symbol is not fully understood. It isn't related to a particular god, despite white supremacist attempts to associate it with Odin, and it certainly isn't limited to the island-dwelling populations.
So in any case, the cross circle is certainly not Christian in origin, as its closest Christian counterpart most likely derives from Egyptian and Syrian art. It's also not Celtic. As Williams notes, the idea of a white Celtic monoculture is largely a 19th century invention rooted in Irish nationalist desire to distinguish their culture from that of English settler colonists. In the 20th century United States, this nostalgic myth of a uniquely Irish Celtic past, symbolized by the so-called Celtic cross, was subsumed into the symbology of American racial nationalism, just as the Irish identity itself was absorbed into the racial mythology of the white ruling class, with the ironic result that the Ku Klux Klan and other white nationalist groups came to use the cross-circle motif to represent a generic and entirely fabricated myth of medieval whiteness. Williams thus concludes that the consequences of this racist history have been so violent and pervasive that even seemingly innocent uses of this historical visual motif, as well as notions of Celticness in general, nevertheless further racist politics by reinforcing the ideological belief that white culture is historically universal and normative.
Thank you. So now we have some reflection questions again for this part of the discussion of the readings. The first one is, why is the term Celtic problematic when applied both to Ireland's prehistoric past and its Christian present? And the second question is, how do such symbols as the Celtic cross, in quotation marks, even when used in seemingly neutral contexts, contribute to a larger racist narrative? I'm going to go into the chat again to address some of the comments and questions that have come up that I think relate closely. Here is a question, and I'm going to cede the floor to the panelists because I don't want to talk too much. I want to be inclusive in all these voices here. Kermit Hovey is asking, and describes himself as a climate advocate. So in the interest of a narrowly focused answer, is the contemporary white supremacist appropriation of medieval tropes and imagery apt, though offensive, or historically inapt? That's a really good question. Who would like to jump in on that question?
I can start, especially with the frequency in which runes like to show up at these rallies. I would say that generally they're historically inapt and offensive. They tend to ascribe additional meanings with the crossed circle, for example. There's been attempts to associate it with Odin, and they try to state these as if it is a fact of the archaeological record, when that's just not true. We usually don't know nearly as much about the use of the symbols in the Bronze Age as they would like to think we do. And in that case, it's creating this false narrative that feeds into this general idea of the overarching white monoculture, but it's not even a symbol that would have meant what they're saying it meant exactly. Or in the case of some of the runes, they're just appropriating a script that was no longer used in Iceland from the medieval period, which is basically from Iceland's settlement, the late 9th century. They don't use runes. There's still runes in Scandinavia, but they're actually used mostly for Christian messages. And the way they're using them now is throwing a rune up and saying it represents a specific symbol when it doesn't.
Does anyone else want to respond to that? Thank you, Holly.
Yes, it depends, I think. They are apt in capturing the spirit of crusade, for example, right? They're apt in capturing that spirit, but they're not apt at capturing the realpolitik of the reality of crusade, right? And throughout the crusades, Christians made alliances with Muslims, different Muslim polities made alliances against Christians, sometimes Muslims and Christians made alliances against Mongols. So they might capture sort of the propaganda, but not always the reality as we know them from the archive.
I have some other questions that are perhaps going into our broader discussion, and we want to leave ample time for that. I'm just trying to see if there are any more specific questions tied to the two articles or responses to the articles for those people who have read them. I'm just going to make sure I haven't missed any questions that are directly addressing them. Now, here's a question that actually goes back to the discussion of Patton. Caleb DeWitt is asking this question. You touched a bit on Mansa. Could you expand on him and a guess as to why the richest man ever is unknown to most people? So this is a really good question. I'm going to bring back that image. It's the portrait of Mansa Musa on the Catalan Atlas, and that was discussed in Patton's article. Who would like to address this question? Perhaps Özlem or Drew, as you introduced this article for the discussion.
Yes, Mansa Musa indeed was known as the richest individual at that time. And also it is said that he alone influenced gold prices in the Mediterranean, just as one person. So yes, his richness is well known, but why he's not well known today, I cannot answer, and I would like to ask it to my co-panelists. A lot of the medieval stories, myths, or resources are not well known in the public. It is known in the medieval academic circles, in the student circles, but this is beyond my capacity. Why is it not well known today? Thank you.
I would just point out that there is this wonderful exhibition catalog, Caravans of Gold. It was an exhibition that took place a year and a half ago at the Bloch Museum, Northwestern University, and they featured this image because they were trying to explore the multiple directions of trade in the Mediterranean world, and we tend to think about colonization and sort of Europe moving into Africa. But this was an exhibition that really highlighted aspects of exchange in multiple directions, and it did, in fact, show the world how important this particular figure was in economic terms in the Middle Ages. And so I think we're starting to recognize these figures. But again, it just speaks to how do we teach the Middle Ages? What do we leave out from our survey courses? What is known and what is not known, because of the focus more on Europe. But it's not hermetically sealed. What we know from the patterns of trade and from maps of the time period is that they were tremendously interconnected. I think, Drew, you wanted also to respond to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Dale. I think so. Part of the problem is, when we think about characters that we know from medieval literature or history, I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of King Arthur, right? We all know who King Arthur is, but King Arthur had several knights who were either Muslim or half Muslim or half black, half white, or black, or who then converted and whatnot. So it's the types of characters and it's the type of figures that we are and are not exposed to, right? And that's worth meditating on, that, we are not exposed to these characters, I think, actively. I think there's a kind of desire to erase or even within the field of medieval studies, there's a desire at times to whiten the Middle Ages. Hopefully that changes.
Here we have a couple of other questions that really sort of nicely lead us into the concluding discussion, which is, what is the takeaway of this session? I'm so grateful to know how many people are attending, and perhaps this is material that is new to you. Perhaps you haven't thought about the issues of race and diversity in connection with the medieval past. Or I should say medieval pasts, because there are multiple pasts and multiple versions of the Middle Ages. And so I want to maybe, as a transition into our final section, which is one of a more open discussion of what we can do with this material, we have here something that was alluded to at the end of Drew's talk on the representations of Muslims in medieval European art. Nailan Erbil Erkan is asking, how do you connect racism in medieval art to, for instance, today's Charlie Hebdo cartoon portraying anti-Islamic images? Most recently, one depicting Erdogan, that is the president of Turkey, and a woman with a hijab. This is a complicated question. Who would like to respond?
Andy, please go ahead. I want to hear your voice.
Sure, thank you, Drew. So I think that this goes back to something that we have been sort of discussing over this entire panel, right? That even seemingly purely political or uninflected visual representations still carry this entire history, right? I mean, we've made connections between works from the sort of pre-medieval period all the way to the Renaissance, right? And so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that we can continue to think about those sorts of residues of race and continuous depictions of race, even in modern cartoons. Sorry, go ahead, Drew.
No. It is interesting that the sort of kind of stop date, the fall of Constantinople to the hands of the Turk is 1453, and for many medievalists, this kind of marks one of the ends of the Middle Ages. But these ideas of the rise of the Turks, or the rise of this group, or the ways that we reinscribe familiar narratives, or ancient narratives onto more contemporary reality, it is worth thinking about. Though I also think that there's a kind of that we should take the modern into account, right? That there are different but parallel things going.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question? If not, then I'm going to move to another question. This is from Dean Krauk. Which strategy is better in combating alt-right and racist white supremacist appropriation of medieval symbols? Sorry, I have to move back up. We just, some new questions have arrived. So I'll repeat that again. Which strategy is better in combating alt-right and racist white supremacist appropriation of medieval symbols? Factual correction, since they are often incorrect, or moral argument and persuasion? Do you see the work that you're doing as correction or persuasion or both?
I'm happy to say something to that. It is a mix of both. It is both correction and persuasion, partially because just what is effective, not necessarily to the person using the symbol, but to everyone listening in on that conversation. It's both correcting the historical meaning to reflect what we do actually know of it via written sources, or what we can, and then reminding students about what biases have affected our understanding of that over time, since most of what we do know about pre-Christian belief systems in Scandinavia comes to us through manuscripts written by Christians. So there's a level of correction that works, but then it's also, I think, doing sort of what Williams did in her article, where you break down not just the historical factual account, but also why they have adapted the symbol the way they have. I think having that part of the conversation, that part of the logic built into how you're teaching about these symbols, both in the past and the present, is probably the most effective way to explain to people what is going on with those symbols in the modern day.
I really agree with everything you just said, Holly. And I would also encourage those of us who teach in any of these periods, medieval or early modern, to think about the degree to which white supremacist arguments rest on the uniqueness of Europe and the uniqueness of quote-unquote white cultures and history. I think we can do a lot to dissuade people from believing and adopting these racist narratives by teaching them the actual history of places outside of Europe and the many historical events that happened there.
Well, I'd now like to continue with some of the other questions. Omar Siddiqui asks, would you say the demonization of Muslims in Europe to this day is really a continuation of systemic racism, ignorance, and hatred towards the other that has lingered on for centuries? It's a really good question.
Yeah, this is a complicated question. This is a very complicated question because it seems that Latin Christian, medieval European perceptions of Muslims were always in flux. Sometimes you wanted the Muslim to convert, that you desired him to convert and have him as a brother, and yet in other narratives, or in other ways of reading. More historical ways of reading, you have situations where the Pope is telling the King of Portugal that, you can't have people of Muslim descent or Jewish descent marrying into Christian families. So I would say that the medieval type of hatred against the Muslim is far more nuanced than the contemporary European and American hatred towards a Muslim other. Saladin is, Saladin is one of these sort of fantasized and romanticized and greatly desired and admired characters in the Middle Ages. In Dante's Inferno, he ends up in limbo, kind of giving him not, it's not heaven, but it's a little bit more of a privileged space. And I think this is we would not see such we don't see such desiredness in the European and American conversation today.
And I would just add that, it is complicated because, you have sort of official institutions, and here's where there is systemic racism or racial thinking, racial politics and policy that for much of the history of the medieval Christian church in Europe, there was a polemical engagement with Islam, promotion of crusades as holy war against Islam. But side by side with that, you have the practical people like the Venetians and the Genoese who are trading with Egypt, with Islamic Egypt. And in fact, the Venetians are trying to play it on both sides. They say they're champions of the papacy when they participate in the Fourth Crusade that ends up in Constantinople. But on the other hand, they're very much, hands off our trade. We have good relationships with our Islamic trading partners. In fact, they had the most privileged trading status of the Europeans in places like Cairo and Alexandria under the Mamluks. So there are these official attitudes that are promulgated often by the papacy and certain Christian rulers, such as Louis IX, who also had very negative policy towards the Jews in his own kingdom. So there are different levels of engagement with Islam, but I think you're right that there is certainly an aspect of continuity in terms of a systemic othering that is based on religion and on the legacy of the Crusades. I now want to turn to another question. Brian Zaramba is asking, as someone who is fascinated by language and orthography in particular, and who finds runes intellectually interesting and aesthetically beautiful, is there a way to use runes in decoration or clothing that is respectful and not playing into white supremacist narratives? Or have their appropriation by white supremacists so tainted their usage that it's impossible to do so? Really, really interesting question.
It's a hard one, and I sort of have to say that it's going to depend on the situation you're in. It's a question that comes up pretty much anytime you see anyone with jewelry that portrays a rune or clothing or decoration. I don't think it's ruined it entirely, because it is, at the end of the day, just an alphabet, but it does make it more difficult to use. You do need to be careful which runes you might be showing on their own, purely because they have been corrupted, and when they appear on their own and not as part of a writing system, that I think might get a little bit more iffy. But I also have a book on my shelf right now that says "Smash the Patriarchy" in runes on the cover, so I don't think it's impossible for us to use that. It's just, we might need to be careful.
I'm going to go on, because we are coming close to the end of our time. I want to try and get to as many of these comments as I can. Pamela O'Donnell is asking, how did the KKK and other white supremacist organizations reconcile Celtic imagery and Irish Catholicism? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I can jump in on this one. I think a lot of the answer there is that these sorts of far-right belief systems end up being really esoteric and syncretic, right? And there's a way that the alt-right, but really just right-wing thinking in general, can subsume these different categories of difference into the idea of race, right? And so the KKK can say that they use Celtic imagery to represent the sort of, as they would probably put it, like the great northern spirit, the white identity, while also declaiming the particular residues of Irish Catholicism in that imagery.
So we're coming to our last 3 minutes, and here is a question that is really at the heart of what we want to conclude with. So Michael Cruz is saying, well, this is all very interesting, but it seems somewhat distant. Can you talk about how this relates to us at UW in 2020? And I just want to call out to our wonderful panelists, who I think have demonstrated in various ways the ways in which this is entirely relevant to UW-Madison and our own state, where we've recently seen people taking to the streets, some of them dressed as Crusader Knights, and seemingly identifying with Crusader Knights as representing a certain ideal of perhaps specifically Christian whiteness in opposition to other members of society. These people who were out on the streets in Madison were responding to Black Lives Matter protests. So I see that as a very direct connection. We can also think about how we have understood the medieval past in our own midst here, referring back to the indigenous burial mounds and effigy mounds, which reflect an aspect of the broader Middle Ages that we don't usually include in our definition of the medieval past, because we're so much focused on medieval Western Europe, let alone all of the Mediterranean world with which it was in contact. So I hope that what you will have concluded from this discussion is that understanding medieval attitudes to race and its cultural complexity can be useful in thinking about the present. Not that one maps directly onto the other, but that there are some systemic aspects of medieval racism and attitudes that are still continuing today. The othering of those who are distant from us geographically speaking, or in terms of religion, sometimes in terms of skin color, sometimes in terms of broader cultural differences. So I want to thank our panelists who did a wonderful job. Thank you to Holly, Drew, and Özlem and Andy. And I want to thank you, the audience, for sticking with us and for asking some really great questions and giving us some great comments. Thank you all for joining us.